Thanks for this opportunity, and I just want to talk about some of the work within SARDI climate applications, I guess representing a wider area of agricultural science and so on. But if ecologists talk about keystone species, I guess you could say that for South Australia there are the keystone industries of dryland mixed farming and irrigated viticulture. By that I mean, if you take those two out of rural and regional communities, you haven't got to do much analysis to see a pretty major collapse. So they're important. As Andy mentioned, a feature of South Australia is that you travel across these transects very quickly. So from Adelaide, as you head north, already as you head across, or even more dramatically as you head east, you get across these very, very dramatic transects in terms of rainfall and temperature and so on. Furthermore, there's a long history of this in the famous Goyder's line. Goyder, who drew his line in the 1860s. Did he visit your farm at that time? So Andrew was a young man when he came through. But this line, I think, and it's actually interesting that that line was drawn, and we can have that argument about whether it's right or wrong, and we've done some work on sort of characterising it and so on. But I think an important point is that it's there, and it's a point for discussion. And it's really interesting when you go to other states, there's really nothing equivalent. So the actual fact that it's there, and it's a point, there's something to argue about, and the notion of this reliability and so on, I think is an enormous, it's an NRM icon, not so much for where it is, but the idea of that. I think an important part of that has been the opportunity to have conversations about climate change, and I really emphasise this idea that what we need to do is have conversations about climate change. I think it's easy sometimes for the whole climate change area to have sort of pointy elbows and push all other issues off the table and say, if you're not totally focused on climate change, you're somehow a denier, or all sorts of other names and so on. I think there's a notion that we need to balance this idea of this being something important, but also how we integrate that with the other things that are important to people. In saying that, I think an important thing to do is not to get lost in just climate variability. So people sometimes say to me, it's much easier to talk about from climate change to climate variability. Often I'm asked to speak, and I notice my title is changed from speaking about dealing with our changing climate to our variable climate or something. It sort of softens the idea of people say, you'll upset people talking about climate change, let's just talk about variability. I think it's important that we talk about both. We know we have a variable climate. Rural industries are very aware of climate variability. We can do more, and we need to focus more on how we do that. Sometimes we talk too much about variability without the important issue that there's change happening as well. The main reason why I think it's important that we keep talking about climate change is because there have been a number of key rural leaders, some in this room here, who've stood up and said, this isn't just about variability, it's about change, and how dare we sort of hang them out to dry when it's suddenly becomes a bit awkward, we leave them out there. I think it's important that we make it clear that we are talking about both variability and change. Some work with Susan Sweeney on this issue with Duna on this idea of the idea of how much land might be at risk of wind or water erosion. Here's a map that is based on the current production and the land type. What it's looking at is a risk of 1 year in 10 for erosion. That's not saying that there is erosion or that, but it's saying that the amount of biomass left after a crop is getting to a stage where 1 year in 10, there's a risk of erosion there. If we were to decrease the rainfall by 10%, that increases. And so this is a report that's available to go through and discuss that. An important point to be aware of, though, is that with zero tillage has been spectacularly successful. So yesterday Well, yesterday evening I was in Mildura at the Mallee Sustainable Farming Systems talking about some of this stuff. This is an NDVI in September 2000 showing, so green is good. There's the drought of 2002 and there's 2006, 2 El Nino droughts. When you show this to farmers, one important point is that they can find individual farms and individual paddocks where zero tillage has been spectacularly successful. So this is I think an important adaptation aspect about this, that adaptation never stops, it's ongoing. Agriculture has always been adapting and is including to adapt to these difficult conditions. We're looking at some work and actually how this how individual heat events may be having this impact and so on as well, which is something to really be concerned about in addition to what might be happening with rainfall. Just to finish up, this is a map of the Barossa Valley, and up the top there are 9 maps. So I think there's a great book called How to Lie with Maps, and that's really pertinent to this whole discussion on climate change. Nobody can produce you a map of the Barossa for 2050 in terms of climate. If they do, show them the door, because there has to be at least 9 maps. Why I say that is that there's uncertainty in emissions and there's uncertainty between the models. So there's uncertainty in the emissions of what happens, there's also uncertainty between the models. So there's no single map, there's a range of maps. What we do have though is we can sort of flip this problem and say that what we have is a lot of fantastic information on the ground in the Barossa, and they're doing a much more complex work on Barossa Grounds project, where we know the soils, we know the vintages and so on. So a lot of this bottom-up knowledge, so a lot of the knowledge about how to adapt and how to deal with these things comes from local communities, much less so from people around with PowerPoint presentations of future maps of what might, that's an important contribution, but we need to rely more on local information. So this is a little bit of work we did with the South Australian Wine Industry Association, with GWIDC. We're doing some more work on really saying, okay, for a warming, drying climate, let's do a stock take on our water, on our soils, on our varieties, on our assets, and think through in a rigorous way about that, with this idea of adaptation as something that never stops. We're always adapting. It's happened in the past. It will happen now and it will happen in the future, and how do we bring climate change and weave climate change into that discussion?